my pleasure to introduce Aaron Franks, Senior Research Manager, First Nations Information Governance Center, First Nation Principles of OCAP, that was mentioned yesterday, OCAP, Ownership, Control, Access, and Possession, in relation to the recovery of missing children. Iatalitso, Aaron.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I think I'm the tallest person this morning to speak, so I just want to make sure. Can everyone hear me? Yeah? Okay. All right. I've got mixed methods here. Paper. I'm a researcher. I still love reading and writing, so I've got paper. And I've got a clicker, a monitor, and I'm on camera and the microphone, so we'll see how we do here. I guess, well, boy, where to begin? I arrived late last night, and I really wished I'd been able to be here since the day before last. I understand this has been a powerful event, and I can feel the warmth and the love and the courage in this room. When FNIGC, the First Nations Information Governance Center, was approached about presenting here, the word Keynote was used, and immediately very intimidating. What to bring to this space, what to bring to this group as a keynote, and then I realized we're all adding to this story. The information that I'm going to share is really about the struggle for Indigenous peoples, and when we talk about OCAP, the First Nations principles of OCAP in particular, it's about that struggle, and sometimes it does happen in hallways and offices and in legislatures, and of course also around kitchen tables and on the land, and maybe some of what I'm going to say here is a little bit on that abstract side, but I think it's important to peel back the curtain on how organizations, laws, the federal and other governments operate there. So I've gotten ahead of myself a little bit. I want to introduce myself. My name is Aaron Franks. I'm a senior manager, as was pointed out, in research and OCAP and information governance. I come from Treaty 6 territory, Edmonton originally. I live in unceded territory in Ottawa, Algonquin territory, where the branch office of FNIGC is. I'm there with my wonderful wife and 2 children. That has been our home for a few years, although I've lived and worked many places. I am Anglo-Scotch, Anglo-Métis, with roots in St. Andrews, Manitoba, in the Red River Valley, and Birch Hill, Saskatchewan, near Prince Albert on my mother's side. Thank you. And I want to acknowledge this beautiful land that we're on, the land of the Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Squamish people, and thank the organizers, Julie and many other people, and of course Chief McNeil, and our wonderful, amazing speakers this morning, Megan and Vanessa. I feel like I'm going to lose the plot here, but I'm going to soldier on. All right, clicker, first time. Let's go. There we go. So I want to share this morning, and I realize I've got a lot of slides here, so I don't want the organizers to panic. I'm going to go at a good pace. I want to share about the First Nations Information Governance Center and give you a bird's eye view of our work. We'll talk about First Nations data and the OCAP principles, what they are. And I've heard both that OCAP may be new to a lot of people, but I've also heard no. OCAP's been discussed, referred to many times the past couple of days. So I'm hoping what I bring here is adding to this conversation and supporting information governance rather than telling you what you already know. We're going to talk about research and data governance harms. And I think the repetition of harm through the lack of access to our data and information about our lost children and our relations is perpetuating a crime. And none of us really want to be here today, but since we are gathered here today, I'm very glad that we're here together. And of course, there's so many positive movements, and tools and examples of collaborative efforts to reclaim our data and information, and we need to share those and discuss those as well. So, F&IGC. As I mentioned, this idea of corridors and hallways and offices, it can seem kind of dry and distant. And I know when we work in Ottawa, we're governed by a board. We are responsible to our 10 regional member organizations, and we are not a political organization. We're strictly a technical advisory organization. So at times it can feel like we're sort of detached from certain realities on the ground, that we move in this different space. But as I said, it's important to sort of realize that these struggles are being fought on all kinds of fronts. So we are a not-for-profit service organization incorporated in 2010 with a special mandate from the Assembly of First Nations to provide services and support to First Nations in the area of data governance. And this work, as some of you know, or many of you may know, including my friends from FSIN, who I just met this morning, our work really builds on almost 30 years of committee work at the local level to bring together leaders, Indigenous researchers, to design and self-determine how surveys and related research were going to be conducted on First Nations communities, on reserve and in northern communities. And that work started in the early 90s with the early prototypes of the First Nations and, at the time, Inuit longitudinal studies, which have since become the Regional Health Survey. And it was that practical work about saying there are gaps in our knowledge, the federal government is not supporting this, the federal government is not doing this research, we need to do it ourselves, that led to the solidification of the thinking behind the OCAP principles, and we'll get there in a few minutes. So F&IGC is guided by principles and ethics and a cultural framework that's developed by First Nations for First Nations. And as I say, we are a coordinating body, so our work is guided by regional organizations like FSIN, Chiefs of Ontario and Ontario, the First Nations Health Council here in BC, and 10 others representing all of the regions, including the territories. We are governed by the strategic priorities set out by them. Our vision is that every First Nation will achieve data sovereignty in alignment with its own worldview. And to support that work, we work largely through regional and national partnerships. So we do not interfere or impose, we coordinate resources coming together. We work with our sister organizations, we work with other not-for-profits, we work with Statistics Canada, ISC, academics, and regional First Nations organizations to generate resources and coordinate this work. And our work's really diverse. And this is where we're going to start to talk about some of the nitty-gritty of the principles of OCAP and data sovereignty. So we do education and training. We have a fantastic online course called The Fundamentals of OCAP, which is being relaunched in February. We do workshops, we give presentations. We give workshops free of charge to First Nations communities and organizations, by the way. We only charge fees to academic research institutions and governments. And as it's pointing out here, research, we do research on a wide variety of topics, including the legislative, technical, regulatory dimensions of data sovereignty and information governance. We're producing analysis of how the Privacy Act and related legislation could be changed. We're doing research on the technical aspects of data governance, like cloud systems, the use of metadata and data repositories, and we also do topical research that uses the data collected from our surveys, including, you can see on the right there, the Regional Health Survey and the Early Childhood Education and Employment Survey and others. And this is a new development. I don't think it's really common knowledge yet, but we've just been funded by the Canadian Institutes for Health Research to do a 3-year study on First Nations ethical approaches to biobanking and the collection of genomic material. And as that project develops, I think that will be of big interest to a lot of people. We're now coordinating with our regional organizations on community engagement and holding a national gathering next summer. So, okay, enough about the sort of the institution. Let's talk about the principles of OCAP. But first, let's talk about data. What is it? What is First Nations data? In First Nations data, there's more First Nations data than there is of other kinds of data, if that makes any sense when you think about it. It's data from First Nations, so that's any data that's collected from First Nations, and typically these days that's quantitative or statistical data on demographics, administration, things like education, well-being. It's data about First Nations. And it's data from or about First Nations lands and territories and waters, the medicines, the four-leggeds and the flyers and the swimmers. So that's a lot, and you know, it might be governments and non-Indigenous institutions might be better off asking themselves, well, what isn't Indigenous data? Rather than sifting through their data sets to say, well, oh, do I have Indigenous data or not? And we know that the information associated with recovering our missing children will take many forms, and it's going to be in many places. And First Peoples have the right to reclaim and care for all of it, regardless of where it is. And where is it? Well, it's held by many non-Indigenous organizations and institutions. The Canadian government holds a significant amount of data on First Nations people. This won't be news to people. ISK alone holds over 200 databases on First Nations, housing, health, education, employment, band elections, child welfare, and more. Data is also held by universities, colleges, other research institutes like hospitals. Of course, there's galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. The private sector increasingly, particularly in the resource sector, as assessments and studies are conducted. So, First Nations data encompasses anything from, about, or by First Nations and their lands and waters, and it's held many places. So the principles of OCAP are really a framework for thinking through asserting sovereignty and reclaiming control over that data. So colonial research and information governance regimes have been imposed on First Peoples in Canada, and of course not just First Nations, Métis and Inuit people, and this requires acknowledgement and correction. And the rebuilding of information governance, gathering, analysis, and use, a rebuilding of those processes that need to be led by First Peoples. And that brings us to OCAP as a tool. The principles, you can see the trademark sign there and the logo, they're owned by all First Nations people and communities. FNIGC, since 2010, has had a task assigned to it to steward the principles at the national level and to do outreach and education, and also to make sure that the term isn't misused by researchers who are making claims about how they're respecting First Nations rights when they're actually not. But that copyright, that trademark is really just about the logo and the acronym, the ideas behind ownership, control, assuring First Peoples have access to their own information and possession of it. These are owned by all First Nations and interpreted by all First Nations. And of course, you can probably see where this needs to be explained to some people at least. These are not pan-Indigenous principles. Métis and Inuit nations have their own protocols. The Red River CART framework, I understand. The ownership, control, access, and stewardship principles, the National Strategy for Inuit Research, and other protocols. So really, it's important to think about data sovereignty through a distinctions-based approach. And OCAP really comes from collective rights to own data and information, and it's really a way of encouraging thinking and working through that. So there's standards of collection and protection and use, and the sharing of data. But more than that, they insist on bringing benefits to the community who own the data, and not just minimizing harm. Typically, institutional ethics standards talk about minimizing harm. But looking at it from the framework of ownership, control, accessing, and possessing your own data is not just about minimizing harm. It's about bringing the fruits of those benefits of your own cultural and community assets back to the community. And ultimately, data sovereignty is an aspect of self-determination in the preservation and development of identity and culture. So I just want to, for those of you who are less familiar with OCAP, we'll just talk about the principles in turn, although you can't really prize them apart. They really work together. First Nations are the rightful owners of their data, regardless of where the data is held. And in the very fundamental sense, collective ownership over data allows First Nations to take ownership over their own identity and not allow others to define who they are. Control really kind of seems self-evident, right? Like, isn't that the goal, to control our data and information? When I think about control, it's like, okay, well, why single it out? It's thinking through the entire data collection, governance, and disposition process. What will happen to it over time? Should this data be destroyed? Some data is closely attached to certain practices and people and clans and families. When those people pass on, maybe that data and information needs to pass on as well. Should it be shared with others? Should it even be collected in the first place? So I think of control as thinking about setting the agenda. Why do we want information? And deciding what standards will be used to measure what a good outcome is. Access also seems maybe sort of self-evident. Well, yes, we need access to our data and information. It's ours. But there's two really important dimensions. It's about saying, yes, we have access to our data, but we also control who else has access to that data and under what conditions. So it's not enough to say, for a government or a research institution to say, well, we've given you access to your data, but we're still going to retain all kinds of access to it and use it for all kinds of purposes that you haven't agreed to. That's where the principle of access comes in. And possession, finally, this was, in the history of OCAP, which some of you maybe have even been involved in its development, far more so than myself. Possession was added later, and it's really that keystone to say, control, yes. Access, yes. The best way to make sure that's possible is that data is brought into First Nations jurisdiction, whether that's into First Nations territory or in a digital age, by exercising jurisdiction into those data systems in different ways. And people have mentioned the cloud here already this morning, at least in my conversation over breakfast. And the bundle of rights, when we think about possession as a right, the bundle of rights and capacities associated with possession really, they remain real in the digital era. There are those who might say you can't possess data, but those people are often the ones who control the data who say that. And the possession of digitized data remains a real priority. So that's the OCAP principles, and for 25 years now, they've been a tool for First Nations organizing, developing policies, putting forth their claims to their collective rights to their data and information. And why do they remain important? Well, information gathering is still largely a process that's done through colonial systems. And First Nations rights and agency in this area is violated in many different ways. And not all of them are visible. The outcomes we feel, but the imposition of harmful data practices sometimes are invisible. So we can hope that we are past the explicit violence of the nutrition and tuberculosis and other experiments that were performed on our children in the residential school system. We can hope that those research practices would now never be considered. But data sovereignty continues to be undermined, both in research and in information governance generally. And I realize I'm I'm going to need to pick it up here a little bit. So I'm going to share some examples. We use these in our online course, by the way, so this is a very condensed version. So as recently as the 1980s, there have been biosampling studies where blood, and here in the Lower Mainland, you may be familiar with this, your neighbors on the island, the Chalmers Nation, struggled with arthritis intergenerationally. A scientist from UBC came and took what was at the time the most samples that had ever been taken from a single Indigenous nation. The study was inconclusive. Results were not returned to the nation. No benefits were accrued, and this person held onto the samples for decades and built a career on them and used those samples to conduct studies for all kinds of things: mental illness, AIDS, population genetics. And of course, this is unethical, but it's also deeply violent to the blood that's taken from people's bodies, which is part of people's integrity. So that's still a visible form of violence. First Nations data, when it is collected, is often over-collected and neglected. And we see this in multiple reports from the Auditor General, that at the time INAC, now ISC, and Economic and Social Development Canada are requiring data from First Nations but not using it effectively to improve the lives of First Nations. So we have violent research, over-collection and neglect of the data that is collected, and we have deep, deep barriers to data sovereignty embedded in Canada's main legislative platforms around privacy. The Privacy Act does not recognize or protect collective privacy. First Nations and other Indigenous governments in Canada are not treated as governance for the purposes of privacy, so that information that we share with the federal government and other jurisdictions in order to get things done is open season for access to information requests. The Library and Archives of Canada Act does not protect personal information once the individual has been deceased for 20 years. All government documents, after they've sort of been used for their purpose, fill out this form, give it to the government. A few years later, it goes into the archive. If there's personal information there, and as we know, so much information is collected about First Peoples, that information becomes atypical. So we know about the barriers, and we feel very keenly what the struggles are. So rebuilding and reclamation. We talk about First Nations data sovereignty, and again, of course, Métis and Inuit peoples, governments, institutions are doing this work as well in their own ways. So there are more chapters to this story. Our data are our collective resource. And as self-governing sovereign nations, we have a right, an inherent right to govern lands, peoples, and resources, which includes data and information. And these rights are inherent, but they're also confirmed in the Constitution and also in the UN Declaration Act, which we're going to talk about here in a second, which is Canada's legislation in response to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So these rights to self-determination and self-governance are only realized by the right of self-peoples to exercise authority over their data and information. And that means that this data and information must be governed by First Nations laws, protocols, and policies. Now, I want to point out again that FNIGC is only a service organization. We are not rights holders. For anyone in government or in the IT or not-for-profit or data sectors, generally here, it's critical to remember that respecting data sovereignty means listening to and respecting the rights-holding First Nations governments. And this is part of a virtuous circle that we try to support in our lane as technical and research supports. First Nations governance of our own data, regardless of where that data is held, is vital to support governance in general. And in return, the governance of data enables data for governance. It's the collective resource of a people that informs how well that people can govern themselves and determine their own affairs. And the better people can determine their own affairs, the better they can take care of that intergenerational resource, that collective asset. And to reclaim identity and support strong governance, this includes everyone, of course, not just people in communities or on reserve, but data about community members who live off reserve in urban centers or in other circumstances, and also those who are missing and who we want to help return. And this is a thing that the Canadian and other colonial governments take for granted. Of course, you need information to have a healthy society and a strong government. But it's a condition, it's a place where Indigenous nations are struggling to get to and making that fight. But here and globally, Indigenous nations' rights to governance and data sovereignty have received, to many people's eyes, a boost with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, or UNDRIP. And a lot of you will be familiar with this document. I know there's many people who are studying it and putting it to work. Of course, Indigenous individuals are entitled without discrimination to all the rights recognized under law, but Indigenous peoples possess collective rights that are indispensable for their existence, and this includes the right to self-determination. How do we put that into effect? Determine your political status and pursue economic, social, and cultural development. In exercising this right to self-determination, we have to have the right to self-government. And in order to do that, we need to maintain and strengthen our distinct political, legal, economic, social, and cultural institutions. And how can you do that without data and information? These are unspoken but essential rights to self-determination and self-government. So can we do this together? Well, I think we all hope so. So the federal government has adopted the UN Declaration Act, which declares that UNDRIP, which we just saw there, is a source of interpretation for Canadian law, and it commits the Canadian government to the recognition of inherent rights and to taking a distinctions-based approach. And it's so important to remember that this is about the assertion of collective rights, and there is so much work to be done by others, non-Indigenous nations and organizations, to understand this and respect those rights. And that seems self-evident, but it bears repeating that this includes the right to our own nation's data and information in all forms: biomedical, geospatial, administrative, oral, not written, all of it, in all forms, past, present, and future. So what does this look like? Well, I'm speaking to a group of people who are doing this work already in your communities and in your homes and in your nations in ways that are just innumerable. But a few examples from our bird's eye view of FNIGC. First Nations are asserting OCAP collectively, horizontally organizing together through initiatives like the Tweegan Partnership and the Unmarked, Cape Breton in Nova Scotia. In Ontario, the Chiefs of Ontario have a data sharing and data governance agreement with the Institute of Clinical Evaluative Sciences. We have the First Nations Data Center. In Manitoba, the Health Information Research Governance Committee of FINISM has OCAP as a plank of its review of any health-related research with First Nations. And then we see increasingly non-Indigenous organizations embedding the OCAP principles in their policies and practices. Now, is that perfect? No, but I think it's important, if you see that in a policy, we're able to hold people to account and say, well, how are you recognizing data sovereignty if you're claiming that you are? So those are positive examples of data governance relationships. The seed of that work in the hallways and the corridors and the offices, as well as in our homes and communities and lands. And we'll continue to face challenges. FNIGC is continuing to strengthen its services, raise awareness, and support informed decision-making. 2023 is the 25th anniversary of OCAP, and we're hoping to have, we're hoping to be present, more present than we've been in regional events. We're hoping to host a national event in July that will coincide with the AFN General Assembly. We are looking for funding to increase our ability to hold workshops in communities. And we're building sustainable services. And that includes the First Nations Data Center, which is housed in Ottawa. And I say this as an example of First Nations-led policy and practice of data collection and stewardship of our own data and setting the ground rules for who will have access to it. And then there's the First Nations Data Governance Strategy, and I've mentioned this briefly with my colleagues in Saskatchewan. Some of you may be familiar with this, that we're coordinating the development of regional information governance centers that will take the role of community responsive data ownership at the regional level in a way that's far more responsive than we're able to do at the moment. So I feel like I've probably reached the end of my time. Yes, sir.
Is any of this information open to everybody here? Do you have a hard copy of it?
Yeah, I can provide this for sure. Well, I want to thank you then for having me here, and just to reiterate that FNIGC is a service organization, and to be able to add and support to this event is a real privilege, and then thank you.
Te iatalitol, Aaron, we say tetzel eight yayas. We say thank you for your good work. And yayas, the work that we do, the work that you do, the word work, it's not a verb, it's a noun. Anytime we do work as a people, it's sacred. And it's a difference maker. And we need that kind of work to support everyone. Like notion of latsa mat, latsa thalat shkwalwan, a good mind and a good heart with good feelings. To Ia, thank you. To our panel, can we give them another round of applause?